This video continues our exploration of the arthropods by looking at the lineage called the Crustacea. So again, we've been in the arthropod clade looking at the Chelicerata and the Myriapoda, but now we're going to go into the Crustacea, which are characterized by having biramous appendages, at least ancestrally. Some of these have been secondarily modified to lose one of the branches of this two-branched appendage. And they are also characterized by a nauplius larval form. This is a really big group, and it's very diverse. Lots of different body forms. As you can see, here's from some very tiny ones called ostracods or seed shrimp. But then some of the ones that are more familiar to you would be in the Malacostraca, like the decapods, so crabs, shrimp, things like that. So again, a big group, about 67,000 described species, but lots more that are undescribed. Again, the ones that you're most familiar with are typically the decapods, so it includes lobsters, crayfish, shrimp, crabs, a lot of the really delicious ones. Most of them are aquatic, and most of them live in a marine environment. They're so abundant in the marine environment, and they take up so many niches that the only thing comparable to them in a terrestrial environment are insects, and so sometimes these are referred to as the insects of the sea. There are some found in fresh water, however, and there are even one group that's invaded the terrestrial environment, and that is the pillbugs. Just as a side note here, this little pillbug on the left, if you look at it up close, it kind of looks like a little bitty armadillo, and there's actually a genus of pillbugs that the genus is Armadillidium. They have very complex bodies with multiple body segments or somites, and the somites do show serial repetition of structures including muscles and ganglia and appendages, and there tends to be a pair of appendages per somite in most lineages. Some of the somites are fused or concentrated in specific tagma. So the tagma in most are the cephalothorax, which is a combination of head and thorax, and it's usually covered by a hard carapace, and then an abdomen. They have the typical hard arthropod exoskeleton for their support system. And as I mentioned previously, they have what are called biramous appendages. This means that they have a two-branched pattern associated with them, and that's what's seen here in this figure. You see one branch is colored in yellow and one branch is colored in blue, coming off of a base which has more of the orange coloration. Now there are some modifications to this, but the general pattern is to have this biramous ancestral state. But if you look across the body, a crustacean has a huge diversity of appendages that have very specific functions as far as sensory structures, as far as feeding structures, as far as locomotion structures. They have a very well-developed muscular system. It's highly advanced in patterns of flexor and extensor pairs. You can see that best developed here in the abdomen of this crawfish, and this well-developed system is what makes them so delicious to many people. If you look at the individual somites, though, you can see that there is metamerism here, so serial repetition of patterns from one somite to the next in their muscles. The brain is composed of fused ganglia that then extend into this circumesophageal ring that goes around the digestive tract, as we've seen in lineages in the past, and then splits into two ventral nerve cords. They have a lot of sense organs, so they have tactile hairs or setae that cover their body, so that gives them a lot of mechanosensory capabilities, but these tend to be concentrated in regions of the mouth to give them more accurate feeding capabilities, and the chelae for catching prey, and then also in the tail in the telson. They have two pair of sensory antennae, as you can see here, and at the base of these they have statocysts, and the statocysts help them to sense gravity, so they're part of the equilibrium sensing system. They also have very well-developed compound eyes that are based on stalks in most lineages. And a compound eye is one in which there are multiple small visual segments called ommatidia that are basically glued together that produce the entire eye, which is the compound eye. So here we have a crab eye on a stalk, and here you can see it from the outside. And if you take a section through this, you can see the individual ommatidia, one of which is circled here in red. Now these ommatidia have pigment cells that are associated with them, and this pigment can change in its distribution along the sides of ommatidia to either focus the light into a restricted ommatidium, and so that's what you would do during the daytime to kind of limit the amount of light going into the eye and focus that light into individual ommatidia. Or pigment cells can retract to remove that pigment and allow the light to cross over across a number of ommatidia, which increases the ability for these organisms to see in low light conditions. Most of these are very agile swimmers and crawlers, but there are some that are sessile. So the barnacles, as seen here, are sessile filter feeders. These are highly modified crustaceans. They have a variety of feeding mechanisms, so many of them are predators, some are scavengers, and others are filter feeders, like we saw with the barnacles. The feeding appendages of the head include a pair of mandibles for the initial chewing up and breaking up into small pieces of food, and then two pair of maxilla, which further help to break up the food, manipulate the food, and take it to the mouth. They have a complete digestive tract that goes from the mouth through an expanded stomach, then through an intestinal system, ending in an anus opening up at the base of the telson in the case of this decapod. Inside of the stomach, there's an additional grinding structure called the gastric mill that's seen in some, like the decapods, something like a crayfish, that is a secondary area where food can be ground up into smaller pieces. They have an open circulatory system, so they have a dorsal heart that pumps hemolymph. This is basically what they call the blood in most arthropods. So it's a combination of blood and interstitial fluid. But the hemolymph is pumped through a variety of sinuses and channels of the hemocoel. So there is not a closed system of arteries and veins. The hemolymph enters the pericardium, this chamber that surrounds the heart, then the heart itself via holes in it called ostia. As I mentioned, they're very limited vessels, but they are found in areas to help transport the hemolymph specifically to and from the gills and to and from the appendages. As far as gas exchange, gills is the most common way that they use respiration, but in some of the smaller forms, they can also just have the diffusion across the cuticle in some of these small species that have very small volume and lots of surface area. And these species oftentimes also have very prominent legs that also can be used for respiration. Excretory structures are typically associated with the head, and they're called either antennal glands. Sometimes the antennal glands are called green glands, and then some are also called maxillary glands. Antennal versus maxillary just really deals with where this excretory pore empties to the outside environment. Is it at the base of the antenna or the base of the maxillaries? Some of the small ones, again, can simply get rid of nitrogenous waste through diffusion across the cuticle. And as we've talked throughout the semester, we're still dealing with animals that are ectothermic. There is some asexual reproduction. Parthenogenesis is seen rarely, but most of these reproduce sexually and they're dioecious. And most of them do show copulation, as you see here in these crabs. And then once zygotes are formed, they're actually brooded by either the male or the female, typically the female. And they're brooded associated with the gills oftentimes, or the swimmerets associated with the tail region. This provides some protection to the young while they develop, but also it allows the parents to guarantee that there's a nice flow of water to deliver enough oxygen across the surface of the developing zygotes. Once they hatch, there are several larval phases that they go through in a process of metamorphosis where they gradually approach a form that looks more like the adult, as shown in this diagram here. The earliest diagnostic larva that indicates you're dealing with some form of crustacean is the Nauplius larva, shown here, this kind of star-shaped Nauplius larva. I don't want you to have to memorize the other types of larval forms, but I do want you to know that the Nauplius larva is characteristic as something that is, if you see it, you know you're dealing with some kind of crustacean. Some decapods can live for a very long time period, so the typical lifespan is 1 to 10 years. But they can range from as short as 40 days to 72 years. And so this has led to a lot of research on anti-aging mechanisms seen in some crabs, for example, or lobsters. This has included the discovery of their possession of specific proteins that help prevent damage to the chromosomes, to the telomeres specifically at the ends of the chromosomes. We found out that they have certain abilities for detoxification of free radicals, and they have mechanisms to remove cellular waste away from tissue to keep them healthier longer. They also keep stem cell activity lifelong, and so they can use stem cells to reproduce parts of their body that have been damaged or were sick and have been encapsulated. So they can encapsulate pathogens and diseased tissues, kind of sequester those away from the rest of the tissue, and then have the stem cells produce healthy tissue in those areas. As far as defenses go, they have a nice hard exoskeleton. Some of them try to hide, and so they're camouflaged. Others, they're quite capable of taking care of themselves. So the defensive chelae that they have can be used both for helping them get prey, but also if something attacks them, they can use it as a defensive mechanism. This is a shrimp, specific type of shrimp called a snapping shrimp. This species right here has the ability to cock this this pincher right here and fire it and close it off so quickly that it produces this sound wave and water bubble that stuns their prey and can actually create this incredible electric charge that produces actually a flash of light very briefly and intense temperatures up to 8,000 degrees for just a brief period of time right at the chelae. Many of them are solitary, but some do show schooling behavior as seen in the shrimp here, so that they'll basically travel together in tracking phytoplankton and zooplankton prey, but also this provides some protection against predators. Some species of shrimp and snapping shrimp also show extended family units where multiple generations of a family live together. And this is oftentimes associated with this family group living in some kind of housing structure that is a very limiting resource in the environment. And so this housing structure is grouply defended by all the members living in it, and it's passed down from generation to generation in the family. So the limitation in the housing structure is probably what is leading to the social system and the cooperation among the many generations of this family. There are quite a few symbiotic relationships, so in some cases there are commensalisms and mutualisms. So we see certain crabs living in association with cnidarians, seen on the right-hand side here. And then sometimes we see snapping shrimp living in an association with these fish called goby. Now the goby actually provides some protection for the snapping shrimp, and the snapping shrimp actually excavates the cavity for all of the individuals to live in. So that's a mutualistic relationship. But there are also several parasitic lineages, including fish lice. This is a fish louse right here, and you can see a close-up of the suckers that are used for attachment to the outside of a fish. And then they have these sucking mouth parts that they embed within the fish to feed on the soft tissue of their host. This is a tongue worm, which for a while was put in its own phylum, but now we realize it's just a very highly modified crustacean. It's a parasite of the vertebrate respiratory system, mainly seen in reptiles, but it's also seen in a few mammal species. It has this thin cuticle that forms this kind of spiral corkscrew shape around its body. And at the head end, it has this hooked mouth that has about 4 hooks associated with it for embedding into the respiratory system of their host. Otherwise, they have a very simplified body plan with no circulatory, respiratory, excretory system. Another even more bizarre parasite is this very specialized barnacle that is a parasite of crabs. It's so specialized that it doesn't even look like a barnacle. The only reason we know is it produces a nauplius larva that is diagnostic of barnacles. But this larva, what it does is it develops into either a male or a female, and the females will find a crab and produce a larva that injects just a few cells into the crab's body. These cells attach to the midgut and begin to grow into this kind of net-like amoeboid-looking mass, this kind of network organism. And that is it's a female individual of the parasitic barnacle that is growing, but it doesn't look anything like any other animal. It just makes this incredible network that you can see spreading throughout this poor crab here. But then it also produces this external portion that can interact with a male of this species, which enters this externalized female part, and that continues the reproductive life cycle. And the zygotes are actually housed in this location, and this is probably one of the more bizarre parts of this. The eggs of this parasite are growing in the location where the eggs of the crab would have been reproducing its own offspring. But the parasite actually completely castrates and makes the crab itself unable to reproduce, but it keeps its reproductive behavior, and it forces the crab to act like it's the parent of these parasites and make sure that they're protected and well oxygenated to continue this life cycle. As I mentioned, as far as habitat use, most of these are marine. Most of them, there are some freshwater ones, but there are one group that are terrestrial, and this is the pill bugs. And some of these pill bugs also are parasites. You can see this ectoparasite here, pill bug, isopod on this fish. But you know more the roly-poly version of these in the terrestrial environment. But these are crustaceans. They're not insects. That a lot of people mistake that. These are crustaceans. Many of these are crucially important as food sources and economically very important for many societies. So think about lobsters and crayfish and shrimp and crabs. So around here we have crawfish boils in spring, late winter and spring. Maine is famous for its lobsters, the Atlantic northeastern part of the country. But some of the smaller crustaceans are very important as far as their ecological roles. They form a crucial link in the food chain at the base of the food chain. So these teeny tiny crustaceans like copepods, seen here, sea shrimps, water fleas, creel, and then some of the freshwater ones like tadpole shrimp. These serve as a very abundant part of the aquatic communities and serve as an important food resource for a lot of animals farther up the food web. One example of this are the copepods and the krill. These both exist in huge numbers to produce a huge biomass for available food in the food web. This is crucial. Having their numbers high is crucial for maintaining certain marine fish populations that are important for the fishing industry. These are also very important in some of the whales, like humpback whales and blue whales, in their feeding behavior. As I mentioned, barnacles are crustaceans. These have some very negative impacts economically on humans. They can produce these growths that can build up on ships and really slow down the ship and cause damage. They can also cause damage in piers. Any kind of equipment that's left in water, barnacles can be a problem in fouling those materials. Unfortunately, climate change is going to have some negative impacts on crustaceans. Ocean acidification and warming waters either work together or separately to cause problems like, for example, ocean acidification primarily. Its effect is making it difficult for formation of exoskeleton in some of the larger species of crustaceans that use a lot of calcium in addition to the chitin and protein that's embedded in the exoskeleton. Increased warming temperatures and possibly ocean acidification are leading to an increase in outbreaks of disease and parasite susceptibility in crustaceans. And these have also ended up causing disruptions of the breeding cycles and also the developmental patterns. And again, this can affect commercial fishing operations. So in review, there's a very diverse group, mostly marine animals. The tagmata in most do show distinct somites, but there is fusion and similar functionality associated with two tagmata, the cephalothorax and the abdomen. Most of their appendages are biramous, or at least ancestrally they're biramous appendages, but there's a huge range of specialization of appendages for different functions, including feeding and locomotion and protection. They have a hard exoskeleton and complex musculature. They have a very well-developed brain with a circumpharyngeal nerve ring that leads to two ventral nerve cords, a pattern we've seen previously in other lineages. They have lots of sensory setae throughout their body, but concentrated in areas like the mouth and the chelae. They have two pair of antennae, and most of them have stalked compound eyes. Most of them are very mobile, either crawling or swimming. The barnacles are one main exception to that, as being sessile filter feeders. Foraging is highly variable, so as I mentioned, some are filter feeders, but many of them are predators and others are deposit feeders. They have mandibles for breaking up their food into smaller pieces, and the maxilla are used to handle prey and deliver it to the mouth. They have a complete digestive system. Some have that gastric mill structure in their stomach for, again, mastication of food. They have an open circulatory system. Respiration is through gills and or the cuticle. Their excretory structures are either called antennal glands, green glands, or maxillary glands. This varies from group to group, but they're all doing the same thing, absorbing body fluids, allowing selective resorption of amino acids and certain solutes, and the appropriate amount of water and salt, while concentrating excretory waste and getting rid of those materials. As far as reproduction, asexual reproduction through parthenogenesis is seen in some, but relatively rare. Most reproduce sexually. They're dioecious, showing copulation and extended brooding of the zygotes. They show metamorphosis with several different larval phases, but I just want you to focus on the nauplius larva. And some of these do live for a very long time. And this has been an area of research to try to understand how they do that and how we might be able to learn from that. As far as defenses, some of them are very good at hiding, so they're good at camo. Others have defensive chelae, and their exoskeleton, hard exoskeleton, provides a lot of defense. Some of them do exist in schools, but as far as more true sociality, we do see that some live in these extended family units, especially associated with rare, hard-to-come-by living structures. There are a number of symbiotic interactions, including commensalism, mutualisms, and parasitism. And we talked about many of the economically important crustaceans and also their importance as in ecosystem functioning associated with the food web. And finally, we talked about some of the potential negative impacts associated with climate change on this group.